You'd better be at the tavern. With a hot grog. Or two.
Respectable ambition. That's largely how I would characterize Banishers Ghosts of New Eden, as a game that combines a daring amount of ideas and mechanics, most of which it actually handles pretty well. I respect the heck out of it. While it slips in its own spectral residue from time to time, its strengths and world building and wonderful performances kept me engaged and curious throughout most of its 25-ish hour campaign. Red McWraith and Antea Duarte are Banishers who investigate hauntings and dispatch the insidious spirits behind them, kinda like a 17th century Ed and Lorraine Warren, except real. Well, not real, it's still a video game, but you know what I mean. This time though, as the Banishers go up against their greatest challenge yet, tragedy strikes, and let's just say they're operating from different planes of existence now.
Something's there.
Something alive.
No.
The game starts off really strong. The early colonial-era town of New Eden feels extremely well thought out and realized. Creaky wooden houses lit by dim lanterns and inhabited by apprehensive, traumatized townsfolk establish a gloomy and intriguing setting right away. The more you explore and talk to people, the more you realize the Banishers are definitely in over their heads, and it's fun to watch them push their abilities to and beyond their limits as the tale unfurls.
You are no angel.
Banishers Ghosts of New Eden has a lot going on within its several main components. There's the overarching story about Red and Antea's quest to rid New Eden of its ghostly predicament, their own situation of deciding what to do about Antea's existence, or lack thereof, the solving of isolated supernatural mysteries to free citizens of their own individual plights, fighting your way through several dozen combat encounters that get notably tougher as the game kicks into high gear, and tackling all of the RPG stuff that you tend to see in AAA action-adventure games these days. That's a lot for Don't Nod to bite off, but they do manage to chew most of it pretty well. The main conversations between Red and the townsfolk tend to have at least a couple of layers of possible responses, with the ones central to the main story and its subplots having the most depth.
How did you two meet?
You'll be navigating through these conversations and unraveling secrets for at least half of your time with the game, if not significantly more than that, which might surprise those expecting a more typical ratio of action and storytelling. Personally, I like this mix. It kind of reminds me of Murdered Soul Suspect, which I also really enjoyed for similar reasons. Now, without revealing too much about the meat of the story, Red and Antea continue their work, despite now needing to collaborate across the lines of life and death. This gives the player the ability to switch between them at virtually any time. While Red feels more like a primary character at first, you'll be switching to Antea a lot to reveal secrets, new paths forward, and different perspectives on seemingly benign objects, unveiling hidden context, which is often needed to progress.
Something's pulsing here. Let me try something.
Don't Nod could have easily left Antea's gameplay at that, but as more of her abilities are revealed, she shares the stage with Red as another side of the same coin, instead of just being a glorified detective mode. She also brings a lot to the combat, but we'll get to that in a bit. The back and forth between Red and Antea feeds into the main story nicely, as it's a very thoughtful hybrid of love story and ghost story that I genuinely enjoyed, despite a few short lulls here and there that took me out of it a bit. As a big fan of great writing and acting in games like this, I'm happy to report that all characters, no matter how small, are developed well thanks to top-notch writing and performances across the board, with consistent tonal direction and authentic accents that give each narrative development real gravity. I highly recommend pursuing all of the side stories if you want to get the most out of this game. This is where it shines the brightest. Each haunting case unfolds a little bit differently, but they all follow a similar path. As Red talks to people, gets a feel for what's going on, then combines that information with what Antea is able to reveal about various objects of interest to piece together the mystery. Often you'll perform rituals in the process to recreate traumatic events and conjure the spirits involved to get their side of things.
My wife.
Eventually, all of this brings the situation to a head, where you ultimately have to decide the fate of the characters involved and thus contribute to the outcome you want for Antea. It can feel a little bit complicated, but the game does a good job of making sure you know what path you're on and what outcome your choices are contributing to. Some decisions seem obvious, like banishing an abusive husband, while others are a little bit murkier, like what to do with somebody who butchered their friend while in a state of genuine psychosis. I like that some situations are less nuanced than others. It creates a nice sense of variety in the story, while keeping things unpredictable. Either way, these haunting cases always end in dramatic fashion, and I couldn't get enough of them.
Save them all.
Red and Antea are a great duo and show their differences often, but also how well they work together and care about each other at the same time. Red's more flexible interpretation of Ghost Banishment Protocol runs up against Antea's less forgiving style in some big ways, which not only makes for a great narrative dynamic, but also gives the player an empathetic representative for whatever path they choose during the game's many decision points. And even though Red swears an oath to one path at the beginning, you can theoretically change your mind about Antea's fate later. I'm not sure where the line is when it comes to locking in certain outcomes, but the game seemed ready for inconsistent behavior on my part, as I initially wanted to resurrect Antea, but changed my mind after a while. And the dialogue between them reflected that, so there seems to be a somewhat dense set of potentialities that no one playthrough can reveal, which leaves room for another go for those interested in seeing everything. Banishers Ghosts of New Eden's presentation and gameplay design seems clearly inspired by God of War 2018, with over-the-shoulder action, not-so-subtle markings on ledges and walls that signify where to go, and a somewhat gloomy overcast look drenching most of the environments. I even think I saw one of Odin's ravens. But by sticking so closely with that format, Banishers also adopts some of God of War's less desirable aspects, like a horizontal compass that isn't as useful as I would like, RPG metrics that change so incrementally that you can easily ignore them most of the time, and a superfluous amount of resource types that rarely give you much of a reason to care about what you have. Whenever I found time to upgrade my gear, I just chose from whatever I happened to have the right resources for and moved on. There certainly are plenty of extra chests and different things lying around if you want to explore and find them, but I rarely felt the need to personally. Red and Antea's movement is nice and snappy, unlike the lumbering Kratos, which creates a super responsive feel, more akin to modern Lara Croft or controls Jesse Faden. While combat itself has just a drop of soulsiness to it, with an increasing focus on parrying and dodging, and enemies that respawn after you rest at a campfire. Overall, it's a respectable mix of ideas from modern action-adventure games that largely work well together, without feeling too derivative. Antea has her own abilities in combat, and depending on the enemy, she can actually be a preferable choice. But I find Red to be a little bit more well-rounded for the most part. Antea still lends a hand from time to time when playing him though, so it always feels like a team effort regardless, which is cool. That said, as the combat developed, it became clear to me that this is Banisher's weakest element. The combos, parrying, and dodging work well enough, albeit a tad mushy feeling, for lack of a better term, and the few enemy types that we do get can interact with each other in ways that make some battles stand out. But overall, it still falls a bit short for me at times, with attacks that often lack a sense of impact, and a rather small roster of enemy types that kind of blur together a lot. Most of what you'll face are wolves, ghosts, and possessed corpses. There's a couple different variants of each, but it's not a very compelling lot.
Not today.
That's not to say the combat is a total loss, of course, it's fine, but it just never quite crosses over into being great, and making me excited for the next encounter. It has its moments though. Red's chargeable heavy attacks and Antea's lunging punches can be satisfying to land. Plus, switching back and forth between them to get the upper hand in different situations usually keeps things from getting too stale. Red's flintlock rifle is fun to use and can deal some serious damage to weak points of certain enemies, or just pepper them from a distance.
The fuck? Pepper!
I actually grew to like using Red's rifle quite a bit, despite it not really being an ideal choice for most situations. Still, I think it's a fun counterweight to Red's less interesting Saber and Firebane. There are some more complex combat challenges and interesting boss fights sprinkled throughout the game that provide a bit more fun and variety, though these battles are vastly outnumbered by the somewhat duller regular scuffles that almost always unfold the same way. Outside of battle, the rifle solves environmental puzzles and opens up previously inaccessible locations. Antea matches that with her own methods of blasting away certain barriers too, giving you a reason to backtrack for more resources if you're so inclined. But again, I generally came across more than enough things as I progressed, so there's not a huge motivation to backtrack outside of general curiosity. You do come across higher levels of gear and weapons throughout the journey, but most of it does little more than shuffling stats around and providing a higher ceiling for future upgrades, which is fine, but the fundamental combat rarely ever feels meaningfully evolved in my opinion. Upgrading your moveset can also be somewhat underwhelming since there's no way to get all of the abilities together. Instead, the game only lets you pick upgrades that are connected to your previous choices, to create kind of an arbitrary through line instead of just letting you get what you want. Maybe this was meant to instill a sense of strategy, but it just created more of a sense of FOMO for me. You can refund and respend your upgrade points though, so that kinda takes the edge off of it. As you can probably tell, Banishers runs quite well on the PS5 while looking gorgeous all around. The quality mode and performance mode are both great options, and although the menu doesn't tell you what resolution you're getting from either one, both look sharp enough to me, so as I usually do, I stuck with performance despite a slightly softer image. Quick shout out to the suite of other options too, with individual volume controls, a night mode that just favors the dialogue sound, and completely remappable controls, which you don't see that often these days on consoles for some reason. This is particularly nice for me because I've never been a huge fan of the modern trend of action games putting attack buttons on R1 and R2, so I put them to square and triangle, where they belong. The music in Banishers provides a moody undercurrent for the game's events, and it's extremely well produced. Great use of authentic percussion and instruments that sound period appropriate. Kinda like what you might hear in Last of the Mohicans or Braveheart, although a little more restrained. So the music goes well with the atmosphere of the game, while elevating the more climactic moments. Part of me feels like a little more emphasis on the music might have been better, but then again, I can see why a subtler approach might have seemed like a better match for the somber tone of the game. This is not a game for those with short attention spans, nor is it for those looking for a straight-up hack and slash with a dash of spooky surrealism. Banishers Ghosts of New Eden is a gloomy, cerebral, slow burn of a game that wraps the player in an extremely well-told story in a genuinely beautiful and interesting world, while treating them to some decent, if somewhat unremarkable, combat throughout the campaign. Despite a lot of Don't Nod's effort clearly going into imitating modern action RPG mechanics, I'd more likely recommend Banishers to fans of games like Detroit Become Human or Don't Nod's own Life is Strange than those looking for the next Evil West or God of War. It makes a vigorous effort to check boxes for all of the above, but I'd still say that most of the value here comes from soaking up the atmosphere and uprooting the many mysteries of New Eden.
And live you both shall, long enough to accept your guilt, and maybe to forgive yourselves.